Hey there, storytellers! Today's video is going to be a simple and spoiler-free book review. Don't forget, if you enjoy this video, let me know by leaving a like down below. And if you'd like to keep up with me and all my bookish adventures, you can go ahead and subscribe and ring the little bell so you don't miss a beat. Without further ado, let's get started. The novel I am going to be reviewing for you guys today is Moonrise by Sarah Crossan. I'm going to start off by saying that this book destroyed me, and I didn't expect it to. So that's what you have to look forward to if you're reading this. The book follows the story of a boy named Joe. He's 17, and he hasn't seen his older brother Ed in 10 years, which at the beginning of the story is 10 years prior to the start of all the action. Then, one day, Joe gets a letter from his brother asking him to come visit him in prison down in Texas, and Joe is understandably hesitant. He's not sure if he even knows who his brother is anymore, and he's not sure if his brother is really guilty of doing the things that he's being accused of. But in the end, Joe decides to go down and see his brother and try to clear the air and try to understand what happened, and hopefully find out if Ed is innocent. Joe travels down to Texas alone. He gets a job in an apartment, and he gets help from some of the locals just to make ends meet because his aunt, who thinks his brother Ed is bad news, refuses to help Joe out, and his sister Angela is unable to, as she is doing the supporting of the family after their aunt Karen stops supporting them when she finds out that Joe is going down to visit Ed. The story takes place over the length of about a summer. It ends in about mid-August, and it's basically a documentation of Joe and his thoughts about seeing his brother again for the first time, about maybe falling for this girl he met, about being unsure of what to think about the people who know his brother is a good guy, but they're still part of the system that's keeping him locked up. And most of all, it's about Ed coming to terms with the fact that he's missed his brother all these years and he wishes he had more time with him. First, I'm going to talk about the style of writing that this book employs, because it's just beautiful lyrical prose, and I wasn't sure I was going to love it at first, not because I don't like lyrical prose, but because it seemed like maybe not the best story plotline for using lyrical prose within. I understand it and love it in fantasy settings. It seems to make a lot of sense, but in something really contemporary like this, it seemed like possibly it could go either way, but I was so impressed with how well written and how beautifully written the whole story was. Sarah Crossan did an amazing job keeping it consistent, so it never felt too flowery and it never felt too much like prose. It was an amazing balance between both of those. The character that I really wish I got to know more was Nell, and she is a girl that Joe meets down in Texas. He befriends her and then starts to develop into something more with her by the end of the story, but she seemed very interesting, very sort of punky and edgy and a little bit wise beyond her years, and she just didn't get a whole lot of screen time. I just wish she had gotten more because she seemed interesting and she seemed like she was going to be good for Joe, and I would have loved to get a little bit more between the two of them. Joe was sensitive and smart and very much aware of the gravity of the situation, even if he kept maintaining his sliver of hope, which no one can really blame him for. If you read the story, you understand why he's holding on to the sliver of hope that he is. But I was really impressed with the level of maturity that he showed for a 17-year-old, and it was something that was refreshing to see in a book, because a lot of the characters I've come across that are young in contemporary stories tend to display very young characteristics, which is understandable because they are young, but it was interesting to see a character that grew up in a way and in a place that sort of enabled him to be beyond his years while still maintaining some of that childishness that you would just naturally maintain. In terms of pacing, the book was great. I personally do not have the patience most of the time to read something that's sort of slow burn, but this did a great balancing act between keeping the plot moving fairly steadily, but not revealing everything so quickly that you're wondering why the book is some 100 pages long and why you're reading it if they're just going to tell you everything up front. That was something I really appreciated because it kept me engaged, but not so engaged that I felt bored reading it, which does occasionally happen depending on how pacing of a book works out. This book was incredibly easy to read. There was nothing that was overly complex in terms of writing style or language or word usage. It was something that I felt anybody, even sort of younger young adults, could pick up and not have any trouble understanding. The complexity of the issue of the main conflict in the book might be a little heavy for some people, but I thought it was very timely and relevant to the world that we live in today. It follows the story of a young boy who's visiting a man he knew when he was younger, who was put behind bars before he could even legally buy alcohol, and yet is still behind bars, even though no evidence was really given that should really incriminate him, and yet the people in the community that are in charge of sort of looking into his case further don't want to, and so they're keeping him behind bars because they feel like they have their answer. They don't want to look anymore. I think that happens in this day and age way more than it should. I know that there are tons of great people in the justice system that work really hard to try to make sure things like that don't happen, but that's not to say that sometimes it doesn't, and that's definitely not to say that it hasn't in the past. There have been plenty of people who were behind bars and they were innocent and then they were let go. So it's definitely a relevant issue to the American society, and I think it's something people should strive to understand more. I think the book is a great introduction for that sort of subject matter for young adults and people sort of moving up into the world where you're going to have to be aware of things like that. Like I said, this book was incredibly emotional for me. I knew what was coming the entire time, and it's almost impossible not to, just the way the narrative goes, but I still was incredibly upset when it got to that point. I actually cried, which is a very rare occasion for me while reading books. I almost never cry. There have only been a handful that have made me cry, and this was one of them. All in all, I think Moonrise was a really beautiful coming-of-age story, a story where someone had to come of age in a really tough situation that most of us couldn't fathom being in, and I think Joe, the main character, handled it with wisdom and grace and much more maturity than one might expect of someone his age, and I was just really impressed with the whole thing. If you're interested, I definitely recommend checking out Moonrise. It's a very quick read. I finished it in 3 days, and that was just because I had to put it down. It's definitely something you can read in one day if you have the time to dedicate to it. I highly recommend that if you have the time to dedicate to it, you do sit down and read this book. I think it's something that everyone can feel emotionally connected to, even if they've never personally been through that kind of situation, and I think it's something everyone can learn from. All in all, Moonrise was a beautiful book. I really enjoyed it. I believe I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, but it might have been a 5 out of 5. I'm not entirely positive, but it was amazing nonetheless. It's definitely one of my favorite contemporaries that I've read. I wish I had my own physical copy to hold here and show you, but unfortunately you're getting a little inserted picture this whole time. But I might actually go out of my way to get my hands on this when I have the time because I loved it that much. So that is it for my spoiler-free review of Moonrise by Sarah Crossan. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!